And we're back for episode 5 of Lighthouse Health and Safety Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Chandran. And today I have a very special episode on mental health, where I'm going to introduce you to my own mental health program entitled The Right Way to Wellbeing. Now, why do I want to share my program with you? I have a number of reasons. But let's look at this issue in the context of our Safe Work Australia's national WHS strategy. Psychological injuries are rising in number and severity. Our national data shows a 28% increase in workers' compensation claims for mental health conditions between 2007 and 2020. In addition, time off work in these cases is almost 4 times longer than for any other injury. So we're in dire straits. And the reason I think we're in here is because from the time I developed this program in 2017, I have not seen a single mental health program that attempts to manage psychosocial risks in the same manner you would manage any other serious risk in your business. And I'm going to use a bow tie method to explain my process. We're going to look at terminology, because I like to start with terminology. Instead of using the terms hazard and risk and consequences, I'm going to use the terms stressors, distress, and strain. They mean exactly the same thing, but are more meaningful to the layperson. I'll then show you how to identify psychosocial stresses using a couple of techniques and the establishment of similar exposure groups. Once we get to that point, I'll introduce you to a very simple method you can use to reduce exposure of people to those psychosocial stresses. I will then introduce you to an evidence-based mental health program that was developed in the UK called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing. And finally, we'll look at recovery controls. If a person does get hurt, if they do suffer strain, what do you do? And the return to work process. So let's start with a program overview. The Right Way to Wellbeing is my own risk-based mental health program. I developed it in 2017 and I showcased elements of it at a professional workplace health and safety seminar in 2018. At the seminar, it struck a chord with a number of people. I was then requested to present it again to the WA Commission for Occupational Safety and Health and the WA Department of Fire and Emergency Services. Now, back then, I was told that the program was well ahead of its time. And I recently caught up with the CEO of a prominent workplace health and safety consultancy here in Australia. And he felt that it still was, which in a sense is disappointing to hear because it tells me that we are still fumbling around this issue. It isn't getting better, and I think the worst is yet to come. Now, I've been asked by some of my colleagues why I would share something that people could take away and then monetize. The truth is, I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing this to help people who need it, and I'm sharing my knowledge freely for that reason. This program is for people that need a place to start. My suggestion is always to start with the end in mind. However, to make this program properly work, you need to be me or someone very much like me, because success requires a good understanding of a number of concepts. For this program to work, you need to have a strong risk management background, and you need to really understand bow tie theory. upon which this is based. You need to understand occupational hygiene or exposure risk management principles. And finally, the most tricky bit is you should have a good understanding of Zen philosophy and concepts, particularly things like desire and ego and attachment and loss and fear. And be capable of applying Zen wisdom to develop advanced resilience. And if I just lost you at that point, don't worry. I will explain all of this in due course. But let's take it in bite-sized amounts first, because this is a lot to take in. Let's look at the core elements of the system. The first thing I do is I want to identify the top 3 to 5 psychosocial stresses per high-risk working group. And one of the ways to do this is to see what each individual has to say about what stresses they feel are impacting them, and then group individuals together who have similar exposures to form what is known as a similar exposure group. This is an occupational hygiene concept. Just be wary of introducing experimental bias if you're using a survey tool. Make sure that everyone understands clearly what a psychosocial stressor is before they complete the survey. And aim for a high completion rate, not a voluntary process. Because if you rely on a voluntary process, you might find that only the people who feel strongly about this issue will complete the survey. And then you might end up with very skewed results. For example, last year I was part of a national mental health working group for the construction industry. I came into the working group after they had run a survey across the country collecting data which showed that mental health was a big issue in the construction industry. When I came on board, I asked the working group how the data was collected, and they advised me that it was a voluntary reporting process. And I then asked them how did they account for experimental bias? In other words, how did they ensure that the data set was representative of the construction industry in the country and not simply skewed towards people who only reported because they felt strongly about the issue? Can you imagine if the people who responded were people who suffered from mental ill health or knew of others that suffered from mental ill health? Could that not skew the data? And there's a lot of money involved in this type of working group and national initiative. Be very, very careful how you collect your data, because if you're going to be asking for funding, you need to be able to provide assurance that your data has integrity. And I felt that that survey did not. The next element of the system involves selecting exposure reduction controls for those top 3 to 5 psychosocial stresses per similar exposure group. The bulk of your mitigation style controls will be in the form of the 5 ways to well-being. And it's best to introduce this program in parallel with the first part. And as part of the 5 ways to well-being, I also introduce some specific training. One of the training sessions is entitled Managing Ego, right? So that's the application of Zen principles to help us understand attachment and loss. I also run advanced resilience training, which is a wisdom-based program based on my martial arts practice. So in a nutshell, they are the core elements of the program. But let's break it down a bit further. Now, I mentioned before, I don't like to use standard risk terminology when I explain psychosocial risks to people. I much prefer to use the following terms. Exposure to a stressor can cause distress, which is bad stress. And when someone is distressed, they can get hurt. That hurt is termed strain. Now, when you're exposed to a stressor, you can suffer distress, but you can also experience eustress, which is good stress. Most mental health programs aim at preventing the hurt rather than optimizing the opportunities for self-perpetuating healing, growth, and joy. It is a mistake. And unless the program does this by creating a path forward for the injured person, then they will always be on the back foot. They will always feel like they aren't moving forward. And this is why people with mental health problems keep seeking treatment and support from their employer's Employee Assistance Program, the EAP. It's a vicious cycle on repeat. If you are caught in this rut, it will always feel like hard work, like you are constantly defending yourself. And when you're constantly defending yourself, the outcome is predictable. You will lose in the end. Now let's examine how we identify those psychosocial stresses and establish similar exposure groups in some detail. You can run the survey type of approach that I mentioned previously. It's a very impersonal approach, and it can be quite effective where trust is an issue in your organization. But if trust is not an issue, there is a better method. And that method is to conduct one-to-one interviews with the various high-risk individuals. And I'll just explain now how I ran the interview process for a company I worked at. And within that organization, we had a couple of higher risk functions. They were the project management function and the senior engineering function. What I did is I pulled each individual into a room with me. I had a bow tie diagram up on the whiteboard, and I said to them, this is what I'm planning to do with the program. I'm trying to identify what the stresses are that are contributing to your distress. Okay, and I explained to them what distress was and what it feels like. To keep them on track, I limited the stresses that they felt were impacting them to just a handful. The number of times I had people come into that room after I explained the process and said to me during the explanation, this is exactly what we should be doing. The look on their face as they realized the integrity of the process and that it was the right way to do things was very, very encouraging for me. As I went through the exercise with the broader individuals, we realized that there were actually some very clear common stresses within each of those functions. In other words, the exposure groups had been well defined at the start. Now you might find that the stresses that people are reporting are all over the shop. That might tell you that you haven't defined your similar exposure groups very well. I was very lucky in this case in that we had established it quite clearly up front. Those stresses were documented and they were taken to management. And after taking management through the process, and they could see the top 3 to 5 stresses that we'd come up with, they believed in the process because they could see that it was real, that it was genuine, and that it had integrity. And that's a great place to be when you are trying to devise your controls. And this is where the management came in. They were the ones that were going to come up with the controls. I was simply their guide. And this is what I said to him. I said, now we have to reduce exposure to these stresses. And every exposure standard in the world has 2 parameters, magnitude and duration. This means that if you want to reduce exposure to a stressor, you must reduce either the magnitude or duration or both. Now, before you say, but wait, Andrew, what about frequency? Well, frequency is a component of duration. So if you reduce frequency, it will be effective at reducing exposure as well. So that's it. That's the simple explanation I gave on how we were going to devise our controls. So I put the question to the management team. To reduce exposure, we need to know what we can do pragmatically to reduce the how much and how long these similar exposure groups could be exposed to these stresses here. And we came up with the controls that we believed were going to work and that were pragmatic. In other words, the controls that management were absolutely prepared to commit to. I took the findings of that session back to all the program managers and the senior engineers, and they were ecstatic. I remember one senior engineer saying to me at this time, "How did you come up with this? This is exactly what the problem is." And I said, "That is very reassuring to hear, because it means that we've now got controls which are actually going to deal with the problem." And let me just explain what one of those controls actually looked like. One of the psychosocial stresses that we were looking at was regarding resource constraints. Now, as we explored the issue, it wasn't a case that we didn't have the resources. We didn't have the right mix of experienced and less experienced people to do certain work. And this contributed to the distress of some senior people because they did not have other people who could support them. So that's how the exposure reduction controls were selected. They're what we might call preventative controls on the bow tie diagram. But now let's look at the 5 ways to well-being as mitigation controls. So the 5 ways are evidence-based actions that are designed to improve personal mental health and well-being by integrating simple everyday activities into a person's lifestyle to foster a happier, more positive life. These actions originated from the UK New Economics Foundation's Foresight project on mental capital and well-being research report. And the 5 ways are simply this: connect, keep learning, stay active, take notice, and give back. So let's look at those 5 in a little bit of detail. Connecting with others is about building and maintaining strong relationships with family, friends, colleagues, and your local community. Continual learning is about challenging your mind by trying new things and rediscovering old interests. Staying active is about incorporating physical activity into your daily routine. Taking notice is about being present and mindful of your surroundings and your feelings. Have you heard of the Are You OK program in Australia? This program is about recognizing when someone isn't well, having a thoughtful conversation with them without judgment, and checking in again. This is an example of taking notice. And then finally, giving back. Do something nice for others, whether they are friends or strangers. These are the 5 ways to well-being. And you will notice that the elements are what you would typically associate with a mental health program. Where my program differs is I look at identifying the stresses and reducing your exposure to them. That is the heart of the program. The 5 ways is a supplement to the program to create something that's a little bit more holistic. And it's at this point I should refer you back to my previous episode on work health and safety legislation, which requires you to take a risk-based approach to ensuring that people are not exposed to hazards so far as is reasonably practicable. So if you know that people in your workplace are exposed to psychosocial stresses and you do not prevent the exposure or reduce the exposure so far as is reasonably practicable, then you are not complying with the law. It is that simple. So now we've looked at how you identify your stresses, who are impacted, how you reduce exposure, and how you incorporate the 5 ways to create a holistic mental health program. But there is also another element, which is the recovery and return to work. Okay? If a person suffers hurt, so if they suffer that strain, which is the term I used previously, such as an acute anxiety attack at work, what is the procedure you follow to ensure they are removed from the source of harm? They are treated professionally, they are monitored, they are returned to work in a controlled manner, in a manner that respects their privacy and dignity. This aspect of the program is essential and normally developed between the injury management advisor, the work health and safety professional, line manager, and the HR department. I've often been a confidant on several occasions during this process, supporting my work colleagues after they have suffered distress that has been brought on either from workplace stresses or issues at home that have impacted them at the workplace. And with workplace, mental health, it's very important that we distinguish what is a workplace psychosocial stressor from one that has originated from outside of the workplace. Although the goal of every employer should be to identify the workplace psychosocial stressors and to reduce exposure to them, we need to be mindful that some people come into the workplace already in a state of distress. These individuals are sometimes referred to as vulnerable workers, and they should be afforded a degree of reasonable accommodation to ensure that they are fit for duty. They can adequately perform the functions of their position descriptions, and they do not pose an unreasonable risk to their own health and safety or that of other people. And that concludes a description of the core elements of my program, The Right Way to Wellbeing. If you implement the program and you have any difficulties with it, please reach out to me for guidance. I am here to help. And that's it. We've come to the end of today's episode. For those that were really hanging on to hear a bit more about managing ego and advanced resilience, I'm going to have to string you on a little bit longer and make those the next two topics in this podcast series. But for now, be well, stay safe, and see you later.